The wind howled through the narrow valley like the roar of 1,000 hungry saber-toothed cats, carrying with it the promise of the harshest winter their hunter-gatherer band had ever known. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, blanketing the rocky outcroppings and sparse vegetation that had sustained them through countless seasons. In the mouth of their cave, carved deep into the cliff face by generations of weathering, a single flame danced against the encroaching darkness. Thak crouched beside the fire pit, his weathered hands moving with practiced precision as he fed dried grass and carefully selected twigs to the sacred flame. At 60 winters old, his body bore the marks of a lifetime spent surviving in this unforgiving world. His thick, protruding brow ridge cast deep shadows over his dark eyes, and his robust frame, though now bent with age, still held the strength that had once made him the band's greatest hunter. Grey streaked through his coarse hair, and deep lines etched his face like the carved markings on their hunting tools. The fire was more than warmth, more than light. It was life itself. Without it, they would freeze in the bitter nights, their food would remain raw and indigestible, and the predators that prowled the darkness would grow bold. Thak had tended this flame for 15 winters, ever since old Grok had passed the responsibility to him, with trembling hands and whispered warnings about the delicate balance required to keep it alive. "Grandfather," whispered Asha, a young female who had recently reached her 15th winter. She approached the fire pit with a bundle of dried branches clutched against her chest, her breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. "The wind grows stronger. Will the flame survive the night?" Thak looked up from his careful ministrations, noting the worry creased across Asha's broad forehead. Like all their kind, she possessed the sturdy build of Homo erectus, thick bones, powerful muscles, and the heavy-set features that had served their ancestors well in this harsh landscape. Her dark hair hung in tangled strands around her shoulders, and her simple clothing of sewn animal hides provided little protection against the biting cold. "The flame has survived 1,000 such nights, young one," Thak replied, his voice gravelly from decades of breathing smoke and cold air. "But it requires wisdom, not just fuel. Watch carefully." He selected a particular piece of wood from her bundle, turning it slowly in his gnarled fingers. "This branch, see how it is dry on the outside but still holds moisture within? If I place it directly on the coals, it will hiss and spit, potentially extinguishing our life source. But if I position it here at the edge, the heat will slowly draw out the moisture while the flame gradually claims it." Asha nodded solemnly, her young mind absorbing the lesson as she had absorbed countless others from the old firekeeper. Around them, the rest of the band huddled deeper in the cave, seeking warmth and shelter from the storm that raged outside. There were 23 of them in total, men, women, and children bound together by necessity and the ancient bonds of survival. Near the back of the cave, Korg sharpened his spear point with aggressive strokes of a flint scraper. At 25 winters, he stood as the band's strongest hunter, his massive frame towering over even the largest of his companions. His arms bulged with muscle earned through countless hunts, and his chest bore the scars of encounters with cave bears and hunting accidents. Unlike Thak's weathered patience, everything about Korg spoke of raw power and barely contained energy. "Old man's tricks," Korg muttered, loud enough for several band members to hear. He scraped his spear point with particular force, sending sparks flying. "Feed the fire, tend the fire, whisper to the fire. Our strong flame needs strong feeding, not gentle touches." Mira, Korg's mate, glanced nervously between the young hunter and the elder firekeeper. She carried their infant son, Locke, pressed against her chest for warmth, and her wide-set eyes reflected the firelight with obvious concern. "Korg," she whispered, "the old ways have kept us alive through many winters." "The old ways," Korg repeated with a dismissive snort. "Look around, Mira. Half our hunters are too weak to track game through this snow. Our food stores dwindle, while Thak spends his time selecting each twig as if it were made of precious bone. A real firekeeper would build a blaze that could melt this cursed ice." Thak continued his work, appearing to ignore Korg's comments, but his shoulders tensed slightly. The old firekeeper had weathered such challenges before, from younger members who believed that strength alone could solve every problem their band faced. He understood their frustration. The winter had been cruel, and hungry bellies made tempers short and patience thin. The wind outside intensified, sending a downdraft through the cave that made the flames flicker dangerously low. Several band members gasped, instinctively moving closer to the fire pit as shadows danced across the cave walls. Thak immediately began working with quiet urgency, carefully adjusting the arrangement of burning wood and blowing gently on the coals, to encourage the flames back to life. Korg stood abruptly, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the cave floor. "You see," he declared, gesturing toward the struggling fire. "This is what your gentle methods accomplish, old man. The flame dies while you whisper sweet words to it." He strode forward, pushing past Asher, who stumbled backward in alarm. "Step away, Korg," Thak said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of years and experience. "The fire needs careful attention now, not reckless." "Reckless!" Korg's laugh echoed harshly off the cave walls. "I'll show you what builds a fire that won't cower before a little wind." He grabbed several large branches from the woodpile, thick pieces that Thak had been saving for the deepest part of the night when the cold would be most severe. "No!" Thak reached out to stop him, but Korg roughly pushed the old man aside. Thak stumbled, his aged joints unable to maintain balance against the younger hunter's strength, and fell heavily beside the fire pit. Several women gasped, and Asher moved to help the fallen elder. Korg tossed the thick branches onto the struggling flames with confident abandon. For a moment, it seemed his method might succeed. The fire flared higher, casting brighter light throughout the cave. But then the heavy, semi-green wood began to smoke heavily, and the flames, starved of proper air circulation, began to diminish rather than grow. "How you see?" Korg declared triumphantly, though the fire was already beginning to struggle under the burden of improperly prepared fuel. "This is how a strong hunter tends a fire. No need for the old fool's useless rituals and whispered prayers to dead ancestors." Thak slowly pulled himself to his feet, his dark eyes reflecting both the firelight and a deep sadness that seemed to encompass more than just this single moment of disrespect. He looked around the cave at the faces of his band members, some worried, others uncertain, a few nodding in agreement with Korg's display of apparent strength. The sacred flame continued to struggle, sending up thick smoke that made several of the children cough, while outside the winter storm raged on with unforgiving intensity. The dawn brought no relief from the merciless storm. If anything, the wind had grown fiercer during the night, howling through the valley like a living thing bent on destroying everything in its path. Inside the cave, the band members stirred restlessly from their uneasy sleep, wrapped in whatever furs and hides they could gather around themselves for warmth. Thak had spent the entire night awake, quietly working to restore the fire that Korg's reckless feeding had nearly extinguished. The thick green branches had smoldered and hissed, producing more smoke than heat, forcing the old firekeeper to carefully remove them piece by piece and rebuild the flame from its struggling core. His eyes were red-rimmed from smoke and exhaustion, but the sacred fire now burned steadily once again. Korg emerged from his sleeping area at the back of the cave, stretching his powerful arms above his head with obvious satisfaction. He had slept deeply, unbothered by the night's struggles with the fire, confident that his method had proven superior. As he approached the fire pit, he noticed Thak crouched beside it, tending the flames with his usual meticulous care. "Still playing with your little fire, old man?" Korg asked with a dismissive grunt. He knelt beside the warmth, rubbing his massive hands together. "I see it survived the night just fine with my feeding method." Thak looked up slowly, his weathered face showing the strain of the sleepless night. "Your method nearly killed it, Korg. I spent the darkness hours removing your green wood and rebuilding what you destroyed." "Destroyed?" Korg's laugh was harsh and mocking. "Look around you, Thak. We're all still alive. The cave is warm. Your precious flame still burns. Perhaps you're getting too old to see success when it happens." Several band members gathered around the fire pit for warmth, drawn by the conversation and the promise of heat for their cold, stiffened joints. Among them was Brak, a hunter only slightly younger than Korg, whose lean frame and quick movements made him an excellent tracker. His narrow face and calculating eyes often reflected whatever opinion seemed most advantageous at the moment. "Korg speaks truth," Brak said, warming his hands over the flames. "The fire burns bright. Perhaps we have been too cautious in our methods." Ura, an older female who had borne 5 children to the band, frowned at Brak's words. Her graying hair was braided with small bones and dried berries, symbols of her status as one who remembered the old stories and traditions. "The fire burns now because Thak worked through the night to save it from Korg's recklessness. I saw him remove the smoking branches that were choking the flames." "Stories from a worried mother," Korg dismissed with a wave of his hand. "You women always imagine dangers that don't exist. The fire is strong because I made it strong." Young Jack, barely past his 15th winter, looked back and forth between the arguing adults with wide, uncertain eyes. His thin frame had not yet filled out with the muscle and bulk that would come with full maturity, and his voice cracked slightly when he spoke. But I saw the fire struggling last night. It was smoking badly and the flames were very low. Korg turned his piercing gaze on the youth, his expression darkening. Are you questioning my methods, boy? Perhaps you think your few winters of experience make you wiser than a proven hunter? Jack immediately looked down at his feet, his face flushing with embarrassment and fear. No, Korg, I was only saying what I saw. What you thought you saw, Korg corrected firmly. Boys often see things that aren't there, especially when they're frightened by storms and shadows. Thak slowly stood, his joints protesting with audible pops and creaks. The old firekeeper's face had grown grave as he watched Korg systematically dismiss anyone who contradicted his version of the previous night's events. Korg, the boy speaks truth. The fire nearly died because you're too old and weak to tend it properly, Korg interrupted, rising to his full height. His massive frame towered over the elderly firekeeper, and the difference in their physical power was starkly apparent to everyone watching. Look at yourself, Thak. Your hands shake when you reach for the wood. Your back bends like a broken branch. Your eyes water from the smoke because your body can no longer handle what it once could. An uncomfortable silence fell over the gathered band members. Even the children seemed to sense the tension crackling between the two males, like lightning before a summer storm. Mira shifted nervously, bouncing little Locke in her arms as he began to fuss at the raised voices. Age brings wisdom, not just weakness, Ura said carefully, her voice steady despite the obvious risk in contradicting Korg. Thak has kept our fire alive through 15 winters. His knowledge is old and useless. Korg's voice boomed through the cave, causing several of the younger children to whimper and press closer to their mothers. We live in a world that demands strength, not whispered stories about how things were done by long-dead ancestors. The winter grows colder, our food grows scarcer, and still we cling to the methods of weaklings. He gestured dramatically toward the cave entrance, where snow continued to fall in heavy sheets. Out there the world tests us every moment. The strong survive and provide for the band. The weak hold us back with their fears and their ancient superstitions. His gaze fixed on Thak with unmistakable challenge. Perhaps it's time to let those with real strength take responsibility for keeping us alive. Thak met Korg's stare with quiet dignity, though his aged hands trembled slightly. Whether from exhaustion, cold, or suppressed anger, none could say. The fire is not a thing to be conquered, Korg. It is a partner in our survival, one that requires understanding and respect. Your strength means nothing if you cannot learn this truth. My strength means everything, Korg shot back. My strength brings meat to our bellies. My strength drives away the cave bears and saber-toothed cats that would devour our children. What does your weakness bring us? Smoke-filled caves and dying flames? Brack nodded enthusiastically. Korg speaks wisdom. Perhaps it's time for new methods, new leadership in the old ways. The implication hung heavy in the smoky air of the cave. Several band members exchanged uncertain glances, while others looked away entirely, unwilling to be drawn into the growing conflict. The sacred fire continued to burn steadily, its flames seeming to flicker more intensely as if responding to the heated emotions surrounding it. Outside, the storm raged on with undiminished fury, as if nature itself were waiting to see how this challenge to ancient traditions would resolve itself. The cold pressed against the cave mouth like a living entity seeking entry, held at bay only by the warmth of the flame that two very different philosophies now fought to control. 3 days passed, and the storm showed no signs of weakening. The wind continued its relentless assault on the valley, piling snow higher against the cave entrance, until only a narrow opening remained for air and light. Inside the cave, the mood had grown as dark as the perpetual twilight that now defined their world. The food stores were dangerously low. What had been carefully rationed portions were now reduced to mere scraps that left even the strongest hunters with gnawing hunger in their bellies. The dried meat that should have lasted another moon had dwindled to a few tough strips that required long chewing to soften. The gathered nuts and berries from the autumn harvest were nearly gone, and the few remaining roots were sprouting and beginning to rot. Thak sat by the fire pit, his stomach cramping with the familiar pain of insufficient nourishment. In his weathered hands, he held one of the few remaining pieces of dried meat, turning it slowly as he calculated how best to distribute the meager food among the band. His responsibility as firekeeper extended beyond just maintaining the flames. He was also one of the elders who helped decide how to allocate their dwindling resources. Look at him, Korg muttered to the small group of hunters gathered around him near the cave's back wall. His voice was deliberately loud enough to carry across the cavern. "The old fool sits there playing with our food while our children cry from hunger." Little Nara, barely 4 winters old, whimpered softly in her mother Zena's arms. The child's normally round cheeks had grown gaunt over the past few days, and her large eyes seemed even larger in her thinning face. Zena herself looked haggard, her body using what little nutrition it could find to produce milk for her daughter, while leaving her own frame increasingly skeletal. "Mama hungry?" Nara whispered, her small voice barely audible over the wind outside. "I know, little star," Zena murmured, tears forming in her dark eyes. "I know." Korg stood abruptly, his massive frame casting its familiar shadow across the cave floor. "This is what your precious traditions bring us, Thak," he declared, pointing at the starving child. "While you sit there carefully counting each scrap like a miserly old woman, our young ones waste away." Thak looked up from the meat in his hands, his face showing the strain of trying to make impossible decisions with insufficient resources. "The food must be shared fairly, Korg. If we consume it all now—" "Fair?" Korg's laugh was bitter and harsh. "What's fair about watching children starve while you hoard our remaining food? What's fair about clinging to the ways of dead ancestors while the living suffer?" Brack nodded vigorously from his position beside Korg. "The strongest should eat first," he said, his narrow face animated with conviction. "The hunters need strength to find food for the others. How can we provide if we're too weak to leave the cave?" Several other band members shifted uncomfortably at these words. The logic seemed sound on the surface, but something about it felt wrong to many of them. Ura stood slowly, her joints protesting the movement with audible pops. "The children eat first," she said firmly, her graying braids swaying as she moved toward the fire pit. "This has always been our way. The young must survive so the band continues." "The children will have nothing to eat if the hunters cannot hunt," Korg shot back. "Your old ways are killing us, woman." Young Usher, who had been quietly tending to the smaller children, looked up with tears streaming down her face. "But Korg, if we abandon our ways, what separates us from the wolves? They too let the strong eat, while the weak starve." Korg turned his piercing gaze on the young female, and she immediately regretted speaking. "Perhaps you prefer to die with your precious traditions rather than live by abandoning them," he asked coldly. "The wolves survive, girl. Their methods work. The wolves travel in packs, and their packs are strong because they care for their young," Thak said quietly, but his voice carried clearly through the cave. "A pack that abandons its cubs soon has no pack at all." "More wisdom from our failing elder," Korg sneered. "Tell me, Thak, when did you last successfully hunt? When did your wisdom bring meat to our fire pit? Your knowledge keeps you warm at night, but it doesn't fill empty bellies." The accusation stung because it held a grain of truth. Thak's hunting days had ended several seasons ago, when a fall during a mammoth hunt had left him with a permanently weakened leg. Since then, his contributions to the band had been his fire-keeping skills and his vast knowledge of survival lore, but these seemed increasingly inadequate against the harsh reality of starvation. "Perhaps," Brack said slowly, as if the idea was just occurring to him, "we need new leadership. Leadership that can adapt to new challenges instead of clinging to old failures." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from green wood. Several band members looked shocked at the boldness of the statement, while others nodded thoughtfully. The idea of changing leadership was not unheard of. Bands had done it before when circumstances demanded it, but it was usually reserved for cases where the current leader had clearly failed or died. Mira bounced her infant son nervously, looking between her mate and the elderly firekeeper with obvious distress. "Korg," she whispered, "perhaps this is not the time for such talk. We must work together." "Together," Korg interrupted, his voice rising. "How do we work together with someone whose methods are killing us? Look around, Mira. Look at the starving faces. This is what Thak's leadership has brought us." Jek, the young hunter who had dared to contradict Korg earlier, spoke up, hesitantly. But the storm is not Thak's fault. The winter is harsh beyond anyone's control." Korg whirled on the youth with such sudden intensity that Jek stumbled backward. "No, boy, the storm is not his fault, but our preparation for it was his responsibility. A strong leader would have ensured we had more food stores, better shelter, stronger defenses against the cold." Thak slowly rose to his feet, his movements betraying the exhaustion and hunger that plagued them all. The firekeeper's eyes swept across the faces of his band members, some sympathetic, others uncertain, a few openly hostile. He could see the fear in their eyes, the desperation that made even the most loyal followers question everything they had once believed. "I have done my best," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of decades of responsibility. "The ways I learned from my elders have kept this band alive through many harsh winters, but I am not perfect, and perhaps these are challenges that require more than one person's wisdom to overcome." The admission seemed to deflate some of Korg's aggressive posturing, as if he had expected more resistance, but it also seemed to encourage him, as if Thak's humility was actually a sign of weakness rather than strength. "Then step aside, old man," Korg said, his voice now carrying a tone of finality. "Let those with the strength to lead actually lead. Let those who can act decisively make the decisions that will save us all." The sacred fire flickered as a downdraft swept through the cave entrance, and for a moment the flames dimmed ominously before recovering their steady glow. Outside, the storm continued its assault on their small sanctuary, while inside, the very foundations of their social order trembled like the flame itself. By the 5th day of the storm, desperation had settled over the band like a suffocating hide. The wind outside had become a constant companion to their misery, its howling now as familiar as their own heartbeats. Inside the cave, the sacred fire burned lower than it had in years, not from lack of fuel, but because Thak had been forced to ration even the firewood to ensure it would last through what appeared to be an endless winter. The old firekeeper sat hunched beside the diminished flames, his body visibly weakened by days of giving most of his food portions to the children and nursing mothers. His once sturdy frame now appeared frail, his thick bones more prominent beneath increasingly loose skin. The heavy brow that had once marked him as a formidable hunter now seemed to weigh down his entire head as he stared into the flickering coals with growing despair. Korg watched the old man from across the cave, his own hunger gnawing at his belly, but his pride preventing him from showing any weakness. The young hunter's massive frame could endure deprivation longer than most, and he used this advantage to maintain his appearance of strength while others visibly struggled. "Look at our great firekeeper," Korg announced loudly, his voice echoing off the cave walls with deliberate cruelty. "So weak he can barely lift his head to tend the flames that keep us alive." Several band members glanced nervously between Korg and Thak, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The tension in the cave had been building for days, like the pressure before a thunderstorm, and everyone could feel that it was about to break. Thak slowly raised his eyes to meet Korg's challenging stare. "The fire burns steadily, Korg. That is what matters." "Steadily?" Korg laughed harshly, gesturing toward the noticeably smaller flames. "That pathetic flicker is what you call steady. My grandmother could tend a better fire with her dying breath." He stood and began pacing back and forth in front of the fire pit, his movements deliberately theatrical as he addressed the entire band. "For 5 days, we've watched our supposed leader grow weaker, while our situation grows more desperate. For 5 days, we've listened to his excuses about tradition and ancient wisdom, while our children cry from hunger." Little Nara whimpered in her mother's arms, the sound cutting through the cave like a sharp stone. Xena tried to quiet her daughter, but the child's hunger-weakened cries continued, seeming to punctuate Korg's accusations with heartbreaking emphasis. "You hear that?" Korg pointed dramatically toward the crying child. "That is the sound of your leadership, Thak. That is what your precious traditions have accomplished." Thak struggled to his feet, his movements slow and painful. The effort clearly cost him, and he had to pause for a moment to steady himself against the cave wall. "The child cries because we all hunger, Korg, but she still lives because we have shared what little we have. That is what separates us from the beasts." "Shared?" Korg's voice rose to a near roar. "You mean starved? You mean watched our strongest hunters grow too weak to leave the cave while you carefully counted out portions like a frightened scavenger hoarding scraps?" Brack nodded enthusiastically from his position near Korg. "The old ways are failing us," he declared, his narrow face animated with conviction. "So we need new methods, new leadership that can adapt to new challenges." Several other band members murmured agreement, their hunger and fear making them increasingly receptive to any promise of change. But Yura stood shakily, her aged frame trembling with more than just cold. "Careful words are easy when you're not the one making impossible choices," she said, her voice wavering but determined. "Thak has kept us alive through 15 winters. One harsh season does not erase—" "One harsh season," Korg interrupted with vicious mockery. "Look around, old woman. Look at the skeleton you've become. Look at the dying fire. Look at the starving children. This is what 15 winters of his leadership has prepared us for." He strode closer to Thak, his massive frame towering over the weakened elder. Tell me, great firekeeper, what wisdom do your ancestors whisper to you now? What ancient knowledge helps us when the flames grow low and the food runs out? Thak met Korg's gaze with quiet dignity, though his body swayed slightly from exhaustion. They whisper that survival comes not from strength alone, but from unity, from caring for all members of the band, not just the strongest. Unity? Korg threw back his head and laughed, the sound echoing harshly through the cave. Is that what you call this? Half our band barely has strength to stand, and you speak of unity? He gestured grandly toward the fire pit, where the flames flickered weakly among the carefully arranged coals. I'll tell you what, old man. Since you're so confident in your methods, let's see them in action. The fire is dying, anyone can see that. So here's my challenge. Korg's voice dropped to a more conversational tone, but somehow this made his words more menacing rather than less. Light the fire properly, Thak. Make it burn bright and strong like it should. Show us all that your ancient wisdom can actually accomplish something useful. He paused dramatically, letting the challenge sink in, before delivering his crushing conclusion. And if you can do that, if you can prove that your methods actually work, then I'll publicly acknowledge your leadership and follow your guidance without question. The cave fell completely silent, except for the sound of wind outside and the soft crackling of the struggling fire. Every member of the band understood the implications of Korg's challenge. It seemed reasonable on the surface, but everyone could see that Thak was weakened by hunger and exhaustion, while the available fuel was limited and carefully rationed. But, Korg continued with a cruel smile spreading across his face, when you fail, and we both know you will fail, because your body is too weak and your methods are too outdated, then you will step aside and let someone with real strength take responsibility for keeping this band alive. He leaned closer to Thak, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the cave. What do you say, great firekeeper? Are you ready to put your precious traditions to the test, or are you too afraid to discover that your time has passed? Thak stared at the younger hunter for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting both the firelight and a deep understanding of what was truly at stake. This was more than just a test of firekeeping skills. It was a challenge to everything he represented, everything he had dedicated his life to preserving. Around them the band waited in tense silence, while the sacred fire continued its quiet struggle against the cold and darkness that pressed in from all sides. The weight of 23 pairs of eyes bore down on Thak as he stood beside the struggling fire pit. The old firekeeper's weathered hands trembled slightly, whether from weakness, cold, or the enormity of what Korg was demanding, none could say. The flames before him flickered weakly, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls that seemed to mock his predicament. Well? Korg asked with exaggerated patience, crossing his massive arms over his chest. We're all waiting to witness the great wisdom of our elder. Show us how the ancient ways can make this pathetic flame burn bright and strong. Thak slowly lowered himself to his knees beside the fire pit, his joints protesting with audible pops that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. He reached for the small pile of remaining firewood, with hands that shook from hunger and exhaustion. The wood supply was pitifully small, just a few pieces of carefully selected branches that he had been saving for the deepest cold of night. Look at him, Brack whispered loudly enough for others to hear. His hands shake so badly he can barely pick up the wood. This is who we trust to keep us alive. Mira shifted uncomfortably, bouncing little Locke in her arms. Part of her felt sympathy for the old firekeeper, but another part feared what would happen if he truly failed. Her mate was strong and confident, and perhaps that was what they needed to survive this terrible winter. Thak selected a single piece of wood from the meager pile, turning it slowly in his gnarled fingers. It was a branch he had prepared days earlier, carefully stripped of bark and allowed to dry in the cave's warmth. But his movements were slow and deliberate, a sharp contrast to Korg's obvious impatience. Is this how you light a fire? Korg asked mockingly. By examining each stick as if it were a precious bone tool. The flames die while you play with kindling. Indeed, the fire did seem to be struggling more than usual. The coals glowed weakly, and the few remaining flames barely licked at the partially burned wood already in the pit. Several band members murmured anxiously as they watched their life-giving fire appear to grow weaker rather than stronger. Young Asha crept closer to the fire pit, her young face creased with worry. "Grandfather," she whispered, using the respectful term for elders, "perhaps you should add more wood quickly. The flames grow so small." "Patience, child," Thak replied softly, though his voice carried a weariness that made several listeners doubt his confidence. "The fire teaches us that haste often brings failure." "Haste!" Korg laughed harshly. "Old man, your slowness will kill us all." Look at that fire, it's barely alive. At this rate we'll be sitting in darkness before the sun sets." He gestured dramatically toward the cave entrance, where the dim light of the storm-clouded day provided the only illumination beyond, their failing fire. A real firekeeper would have built a blaze by now that could warm the entire cave. Instead, we watch our precious flame die under your trembling hands. Thak carefully placed his selected piece of wood at the edge of the coals, positioning it precisely so that one end would catch fire gradually, while the other end remained unburned. But his weakened state made even this simple task difficult, and he had to steady himself against the cave floor to maintain his balance. "See how he struggles," Brack pointed out to anyone willing to listen. "His body betrays him. How can we trust someone who cannot even manage the simple task of feeding a fire?" Ura stood slowly, her aged frame trembling with indignation. "The boy does not understand what he watches," she said firmly. "Thak's methods have kept our fire alive through storms that would have defeated lesser keepers. His methods are keeping it barely alive," Korg countered. "Look at those flames. They're smaller than when he started. This is what 15 winters of experience accomplishes, the slow death of everything he touches." The accusation was cruel, but appeared to hold some truth. The fire did look weaker than it had moments before, and Thak's careful placement of the single piece of wood seemed inadequate to address the growing problem. Several band members began to exchange worried glances, their faith in their firekeeper wavering like the flames themselves. Jack, the young hunter who had previously tried to defend Thak, looked uncertain as he watched the proceedings. But surely he knows what he's doing," he said hesitantly. "The fire has never failed us before." "Never failed us before." Korg's voice rose with incredulous anger. "Look around, boy. We're trapped in this cave starving with a fire that grows weaker by the moment. If this isn't failure, what would you call it?" Thak continued his methodical work, seemingly oblivious to the growing criticism and doubt surrounding him. He selected a second piece of wood, smaller than the first, and began examining it with the same careful attention he had given the previous piece. But his movements were becoming noticeably slower, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold air in the cave. "He's stalling," Brack observed with growing conviction. "He knows he cannot succeed, so he delays the inevitable failure with pointless rituals." "No," Asha protested, though her voice lacked conviction. "He's following the proper methods. The old ways require results," Korg interrupted savagely. "Not endless preparation while the fire dies and the band suffers. Watch him, girl. See how he fumbles with that wood like a child learning to use tools for the first time." It was true that Thak's hands seemed less steady than usual, and his careful examination of each piece of wood was taking far longer than normal. The old firekeeper appeared to be struggling, not just with the physical demands of the task, but with something deeper, a crisis of confidence that manifested in increasingly hesitant movements. "Perhaps," Xena said quietly, her starving daughter still whimpering in her arms, "perhaps Korg should help. Two working together might—" "No." Korg's rejection was immediate and absolute. This was his challenge to meet. "I offered him the chance to prove that his methods work. If he cannot do so alone, then he proves my point, that his time has passed and new leadership is needed." The fire flickered more weakly, and several of the smallest flames actually went out entirely, leaving only glowing coals and one struggling flame that seemed ready to die at any moment. A collective gasp went up from the watching band members, and even Thak's supporters began to look deeply concerned. "The fire dies," Brack said, with what sounded almost like satisfaction. "The great firekeeper cannot even maintain what we already had, let alone build it into something stronger." Thak finally placed his second piece of wood into the fire pit, but his movements were so slow and uncertain that it seemed almost painful to watch. The old firekeeper, who had once been the pride of the band, now appeared as a broken shadow of his former self, defeated by hunger, age, and the crushing weight of expectations he might no longer be able to meet. The cave had fallen into an oppressive silence, broken only by the crackling of dying embers and the relentless howling of wind outside. 23 souls watched as their firekeeper knelt before what appeared to be the final failure of everything they had trusted for 15 winters. The flames had dwindled to almost nothing, just a few weak tongues of fire licking desperately at the edges of glowing coals. Thak remained motionless beside the fire pit, his weathered hands hovering over the struggling flames, as if he were trying to will them back to life through sheer determination. But his body betrayed him at every turn. His arms shook from weakness. His breathing came in labored gasps, and sweat continued to bead on his forehead despite the growing cold in the cave. "Well?" Korg's voice cut through the silence, like a sharp flint blade. "Is this the great wisdom of our ancestors? Is this the result of 15 winters of experience? A fire that dies while you kneel beside it like a helpless child?" Several band members shifted uncomfortably, their eyes moving between the failing fire and their increasingly desperate situation. Even those who had remained loyal to Thak could see that something was terribly wrong. The old firekeeper, who had once worked with confident precision, now seemed lost and uncertain, fumbling with tasks that should have been as natural as breathing. "He's lost his strength," Brack whispered loudly enough for others to hear. "Age has taken his skill along with his body. We cannot trust our survival to someone who can no longer perform the most basic duties." Young Asher looked back and forth between Thak and the dying fire, with tears streaming down her face. The girl who had been the old firekeeper's most devoted student now watched her teacher appear to fail at the very thing he had taught her to revere above all else. "Grandfather," she whispered desperately, "please, the fire, it's almost gone." Thak slowly turned his head to look at the young girl, and for a moment something flickered in his dark eyes. Not defeat, but a deep sadness that seemed to encompass far more than just this moment of crisis. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Child, do you remember the lesson I taught you about the heart of the fire?" Asher blinked in confusion, wiping tears from her cheeks. The heart? Foolish riddles," Korg spat. "More useless words, while the flames die and our shelter grows cold. This is exactly the kind of meaningless mysticism that—" "The heart of the fire is not the flames we see," Thak continued, his voice growing slightly stronger as he looked directly at Asher. "What do we see, child? What burns beneath?" Despite her confusion and growing fear, Asher found herself drawn to look more closely at the fire pit. At first, she saw only what everyone else saw, dying flames and what appeared to be failure. But as her eyes adjusted and her mind recalled countless lessons by the firekeeper's side, she began to notice something different. The coals," she said hesitantly. "The coals still glow." "Yes," Thak nodded, and for the first time since the test began he seemed to move with purpose. "The coals. Not just glowing, child. How do they glow?" Asher looked more carefully, and gradually she began to see what Thak was showing her. The coals weren't just glowing randomly. They were arranged in a specific pattern, with channels of air moving between them in precise ways. Even in his apparent weakness and fumbling, the old firekeeper had been creating something deliberate and planned. They're arranged," she breathed in amazement. "The air flows between them in patterns." "Meaningless observations," Korg declared, though his voice carried a slight note of uncertainty. "Pretty patterns don't create heat or light. Action creates results, not—" His words were cut off as Thak suddenly moved with swift, decisive precision that caught everyone off guard. The old firekeeper, who had seemed so weak and hesitant, now acted with the fluid confidence of decades of experience. He selected 3 specific pieces of wood from his carefully hoarded supply, not randomly, but with exact knowledge of their size, dryness, and burning characteristics. With movements that belied his apparent frailty, Thak placed the wood pieces in precise positions among the specially arranged coals, not on top of them, not beside them, but integrated into the pattern he had been creating throughout his seemingly failed attempts. The wood fit into the arrangement like pieces of a complex puzzle, each one positioned to take advantage of the specific air currents and heat patterns he had been building. "What is he?" Brack began, but his question was answered before he could finish it. The fire exploded into life, not gradually, not with the slow building that everyone expected, but with a sudden burst of flame that filled the fire pit with brilliant, dancing light. The carefully arranged coals and precisely positioned wood created a combustion so complete and efficient that the cave was instantly filled with warmth and brightness that surpassed anything they had experienced in days. A collective gasp went up from the watching band members as shadows were suddenly banished from corners that had grown dim and cold. The heat radiating from the fire pit was so intense that those closest had to step backward, and the light was bright enough to clearly illuminate every face in the cave. But Thak wasn't finished. Moving with the same fluid precision, he began adding larger pieces of wood to the blaze, not haphazardly, but in the same methodical pattern that had created the initial success. Each piece of fuel was positioned to maximize airflow and heat distribution, creating a fire that burned hotter and more efficiently than anyone could remember seeing. Within moments, what had appeared to be inevitable failure had transformed into a fire that could have warmed twice their number. The flames danced high and bright, casting cheerful light on walls that had grown grim with shadow, and the heat penetrated to every corner of their cave sanctuary. "Impossible," Korg whispered, staring at the magnificent blaze with obvious shock. Thak slowly rose to his feet, and though his movement still showed the effects of hunger and exhaustion, there was something different about his posture now. The defeated slouch was gone, replaced by the quiet dignity of someone who had just demonstrated mastery of his craft in the most dramatic way possible. "The fire was never failing," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly over the cheerful crackling of the flames. "It was being prepared. Every piece of wood I placed, every moment of seeming hesitation, all were part of building the foundation for what you see now." He looked directly at Korg, his dark eyes reflecting the bright firelight with calm confidence. "Strength alone cannot create this, young hunter. Haste and force cannot build what requires patience and understanding. The fire teaches us that the greatest achievements often appear to be failures until the moment they reveal their true purpose." The magnificent fire roared with a life and intensity that seemed to transform the very atmosphere of the cave. Heat radiated outward in waves so powerful that several band members had to move back from the fire pit, their faces flushed with warmth they hadn't felt in days. The flames danced high and bright, casting cheerful golden light on walls that had grown dim and grey with despair, while shadows that had seemed threatening now appeared friendly and comforting. Korg stood frozen in place, his massive frame silhouetted against the brilliant firelight, his mouth hanging open in shock. The young hunter, who had been so confident in his superiority, so certain of Thak's failure, now stared at the blazing fire with the expression of someone who had just witnessed something beyond his understanding. "This cannot be," Brack whispered, his narrow face reflecting confusion and disbelief. "The fire was dying, we all saw it dying. How could it suddenly become so strong?" Thak remained standing beside the fire pit, his weathered frame still showing the effects of hunger and exhaustion, but his posture now radiated a quiet dignity that commanded respect. The old firekeeper, who had appeared so weak and fumbling just moments before now, seemed transformed by the success of his carefully planned demonstration. "Every piece of preparation has its purpose," he said calmly, his voice carrying clearly over the crackling flames. What appeared to be failure was actually foundation. What looked like weakness was actually the careful arrangement of elements that would soon become strength. Young Asha stared at her teacher with wide eyes, her earlier tears now dried by the heat of the magnificent blaze. You planned this," she breathed in amazement. "Every movement, every piece of wood. It was all part of a greater design." "The fire teaches patience," Thak replied with a gentle nod. "It rewards those who understand its nature rather than those who try to force it into submission. Strength without wisdom is like a storm without direction, powerful but ultimately destructive." Several band members began moving closer to the fire pit, drawn by the incredible warmth that now filled their sanctuary. Children who had been whimpering with cold and hunger now smiled with delight as they felt genuine heat penetrating their small bodies. Xena held little Nara closer to the flames, and the child's whimpering stopped as warmth enveloped her. "Mama, warm!" Nara exclaimed with joy, clapping her small hands together as she experienced real comfort for the first time in days. "Yes, little star," Xena murmured, tears of relief streaming down her face. "The fire is strong and warm again." Mira looked back and forth between the brilliant blaze and her mate's stunned expression, her own face reflecting confusion and uncertainty. She had supported Korg's challenge because his confidence had seemed so absolute, his arguments so persuasive. But now, witnessing the complete reversal of what had appeared to be certain failure, she began to question everything she had believed about the situation. "Korg," she whispered, bouncing little Locke nervously in her arms. "The fire—" How could Thak have known? How could he have planned for this? Korg turned his shocked gaze on his mate, and for a moment, his usual confident mask slipped entirely. The young hunter, who had been so certain of his own superiority, so dismissive of ancient wisdom, now found himself confronting the undeniable evidence that he had fundamentally misunderstood what he was witnessing. I don't understand," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "The flames were dying." His hands were shaking. He seemed so weak. Seeming and being are often different things. Ura said gently, her aged voice carrying the weight of years spent observing the subtle complexities of life. Those who are truly wise sometimes appear foolish to those who mistake noise for strength. Jek, the young hunter who had wavered between supporting Korg and defending Thak, now stared at the fire with obvious awe. "The heat is incredible," he said wonderingly. "It's warmer in here than it's been since the storm began. How is that possible?" Thak gestured toward the fire pit, where the flames burned in complex patterns that seemed to dance with mathematical precision. The arrangement of coals creates channels for air to flow in specific ways. Each piece of wood is positioned to burn completely and efficiently, with no waste of fuel or heat. This fire will burn longer and warmer than one twice its size built without understanding. He looked directly at Korg, his dark eyes reflecting compassion rather than triumph. "You see strength in the size of the flames, young hunter, but true strength lies in the knowledge of how to create exactly what is needed, when it is needed, with the resources available." The implication was clear to everyone listening. Korg had criticized Thak's careful rationing of firewood, but the old firekeeper had been preserving exactly what he needed to create this magnificent blaze when it would have the greatest impact. Every piece of wood that had seemed hoarded had actually been saved for this precise moment. You knew," Korg said slowly, his voice filled with dawning understanding. "You knew I would challenge you. You knew everyone would doubt. You planned for this exact situation." Thak's weathered face showed a slight smile, the first genuine expression of happiness anyone had seen from him in days. "I knew that hunger and fear make people question everything, including traditions that have kept them alive. I knew that appearing strong is sometimes more important than being strong, and that sometimes a leader must demonstrate worth rather than simply claim it." The admission sent murmurs through the gathered band members. Many of them began to realize that they had been witnesses not just to a fire-building demonstration, but to a carefully orchestrated lesson in leadership, wisdom, and the dangerous tendency to mistake surface appearances for underlying reality. Brack shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence in Korg's position now clearly shaken. But the way you fumbled with the wood, your hands were shaking. You seemed so uncertain." "My hands shook from hunger, as did yours," Thak replied honestly. "My body is weakened by the same hardships that affect us all, but my knowledge remained strong, even when my flesh was failing. This is why we preserve wisdom through teaching, through passing understanding from one generation to the next." The fire continued to roar with magnificent intensity, its heat so powerful that the cave had become almost uncomfortably warm after days of bone-deep cold. The transformation was so complete and dramatic that it seemed to represent more than just physical warmth. It felt like hope itself had been rekindled in their desperate sanctuary. The warmth of the magnificent fire had transformed more than just the temperature in the cave. It had fundamentally altered the emotional landscape of the entire band. Where despair had reigned moments before, hope now flickered as brightly as the flames themselves. Children laughed with delight as they felt genuine warmth for the first time in days, while adults who had grown gaunt with hunger found themselves standing straighter, their spirits lifted by the undeniable proof of their firekeeper's mastery. But not everyone basked in the renewed warmth with equal comfort. Korg stood apart from the others, his massive frame rigid with an internal struggle that played out visibly across his weathered features. The young hunter who had been so confident in his challenge, so certain of Thak's failure and his own superiority, now faced the crushing realization that he had been completely and utterly wrong about everything. "The challenge was clear," Thak said quietly, his voice carrying easily over the cheerful crackling of the fire. "Light the fire and make it burn bright and strong." The fire now burns brighter than it has in many days, warming our entire shelter and using our precious fuel more efficiently than ever before. He looked directly at Korg, with eyes that held no malice, only patient expectation. "You gave your word before the entire band. You promised to publicly acknowledge my leadership and follow my guidance without question if I could prove that my methods work." The cave fell silent, except for the sound of the roaring fire. 23 pairs of eyes turned toward Korg, waiting to see how the proud young hunter would respond to this moment of reckoning. Some faces showed sympathy for his predicament, others showed curiosity, and a few showed the satisfaction of seeing arrogance brought low. Korg's jaw worked silently as he struggled with emotions that seemed to tear at him from different directions. His pride, which had been the driving force behind his challenge to Thak's authority, now warred with his sense of honor and the undeniable evidence of what he had just witnessed. I spoke those words, he admitted finally, his voice barely audible over the crackling flames. But I did not expect, I could not have imagined, you could not have imagined that an old man's trembling hands could create something beyond your understanding. Thak's question was gentle but pointed. Or you could not have imagined that wisdom might triumph over strength. The word stung visibly, causing Korg to flinch, as if struck by a physical blow. Several band members shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the painful truth in Thak's observation. The young hunter's entire identity had been built around his physical superiority and his belief that strength was the ultimate solution to every problem. "You made me look like a fool," Korg said, his voice carrying a mixture of pain and anger. "You let me mock you, let me call you weak and useless, all while you planned this demonstration." "I let you reveal your own character," Thak replied calmly. "I did nothing to encourage your mockery or your cruelty. Those came from within you, not from any action of mine." The observation cut deeply, and Korg's face flushed with shame as he remembered his harsh words and public humiliation of the elder. In front of the entire band, he had called Thak weak, useless, a failure whose time had passed. He had pointed to starving children as evidence of the old firekeeper's incompetence, had laughed at his trembling hands, and compared him to a frightened scavenger. Brack, who had been Korg's most vocal supporter, now found himself in an equally uncomfortable position. The narrow-faced hunter looked back and forth between Korg and Thak with obvious discomfort, realizing that his own words and actions had been equally misguided. We saw what we thought we saw," Brack said hesitantly, his voice lacking any of its earlier conviction. "The fire appeared to be failing. Your methods seemed inadequate to the challenge." "My methods were perfectly adequate," Thak replied with quiet dignity. "It was your understanding that proved inadequate. You saw surface appearances and assumed you understood the deeper reality. This is a dangerous mistake for any hunter to make." Young Asha approached the fire pit with reverence, her earlier tears now replaced by wonder and renewed respect for her teacher. "Grandfather, will you teach me this technique? The way you arranged the coals and positioned the wood, I want to learn everything you know." "Of course, child," Thak replied, with the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him in days. "But the technique is only part of the lesson. The greater teaching is about patience, preparation, and the wisdom to see beyond immediate appearances." He gestured toward the magnificent fire that continued to burn with efficient intensity. "This blaze will last through the night and well into tomorrow, providing more warmth from less wood than any fire we have built this winter. But it required understanding, planning, and the courage to appear foolish while working toward a greater goal." The implications of his words were not lost on anyone present. Thak had endured public mockery, had allowed his reputation and authority to be questioned and challenged, all while maintaining faith in his own knowledge and abilities. He had demonstrated leadership, not through dominance or force, but through results that spoke louder than any argument. Mira held her infant son closer to the warmth of the fire, her eyes fixed on her mate's struggle with obvious concern. "Korg," she said softly, "you gave your word. The entire band heard your promise." Korg turned toward his mate, and the pain in his expression was unmistakable. Everything he had believed about himself and his place in the band had been shaken to its foundation. The strength and confidence that had defined him now seemed like arrogance and ignorance in the face of Thak's quiet mastery. "I know what I promised," he said heavily. "I know what I must do." He took a deep breath and walked slowly toward Thak, each step seeming to cost him considerable effort. When he reached the fire pit, he slowly lowered himself to one knee, a gesture of respect and submission that sent murmurs of surprise through the watching band members. "Firekeeper," he said formally, his voice carrying throughout the cave despite its quiet tone. "I was wrong. My challenge was born of ignorance and pride. Your wisdom surpasses my understanding, and your methods achieve what my strength could not." The formal words of acknowledgement seemed to pain him physically, but he continued with visible determination. "Before this band, I publicly acknowledge your leadership and pledge to follow your guidance without question, as I promised." The cave fell completely silent as everyone absorbed the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Korg, the strongest and most confident among them, was publicly admitting his error and submitting to the authority he had so recently challenged. It was a moment that would reshape the dynamics of their small community in ways that would last long beyond the current crisis. Thak looked down at Korg's kneeling form for a long moment, his weathered face reflecting the dancing firelight with an expression of deep thoughtfulness. The old firekeeper understood that this was more than just a moment of victory or vindication. It was an opportunity to heal the wounds that had been torn open within their small band, and to teach lessons that would serve them all in the difficult times ahead. "Rise, young hunter," Thak said gently, extending his hand to help Korg to his feet. "Kneeling is not necessary between band members. We are all equals in our struggle to survive." Korg looked up in surprise, clearly having expected harsher treatment or at least some measure of gloating from the elder he had so cruelly mocked. Instead, he saw only compassion and understanding in Thak's dark eyes. Slowly, he accepted the offered hand and allowed himself to be helped to his feet. "Your strength has value, Korg," Thak continued, his voice carrying clearly through the warm cave. "Your hunting skills have kept this band fed through many seasons. Your courage has protected us from predators that would have destroyed lesser groups. These gifts should not be dismissed simply because they were temporarily misdirected." The unexpected words of praise seemed to affect Korg more powerfully than any punishment could have. The young hunter's eyes filled with tears that he struggled to contain, his massive frame trembling with emotions he had rarely allowed himself to feel. "But I mocked you," he said hoarsely. "I called you weak and useless. I turned others against you when you needed support most. How can you speak of my value after such cruelty?" Thak moved closer to the magnificent fire he had created, gesturing for the entire band to gather around the warmth. As they formed a circle around the blazing pit, their faces glowing with heat and light that seemed to represent more than just physical comfort, he began to speak with the voice of a teacher rather than a victor. "Observe this fire," he said, pointing to the dancing flames. "Each piece of wood serves a purpose. The large logs provide steady, long-lasting heat. The smaller branches catch quickly and spread the flames to new fuel. The twigs and kindling create the initial spark that brings everything to life." He looked around the circle at each face in turn, making sure his words reached everyone. No single element could create this fire alone. The large logs without kindling would never ignite. The kindling without larger fuel would burn out quickly. Each component needs the others to achieve what none could accomplish independently. Young Asher nodded eagerly, understanding beginning to dawn in her bright eyes. "The band is like the fire," she said wonderingly. "Each person has a different role, but all are needed." "Exactly, child," Thak replied with approval. "Korg's strength is like the large logs, steady, powerful, essential for long-term survival. But strength alone cannot start the fire of leadership. It needs the kindling of wisdom, the careful preparation of experience, and the patient nurturing of understanding." He turned to face Korg directly, his expression showing no trace of resentment or triumph. "Your challenge was not born of evil intent, young hunter. It came from fear. Fear that your band was failing, fear that traditional methods were inadequate, fear that death waited outside our shelter." Korg nodded slowly, recognition flooding his features as he understood the truth of Thak's words. "I was afraid," he admitted quietly. "Afraid of watching everyone I care about slowly starve. Afraid that my strength wasn't enough to save them." "Fear makes us all act in ways we later regret," Yura said gently from her place in the circle. The old woman's voice carried the authority of one who had witnessed many such moments of crisis and reconciliation. "The measure of a person is not whether they feel fear, but how they respond when they recognize their mistakes." Brack, who had been noticeably silent since Korg's formal acknowledgement, now found the courage to speak. I supported Korg's challenge because I was also afraid. I saw the dwindling food and the struggling fire, and I thought perhaps new leadership was needed. But I see now that I understood neither the true situation nor the qualities that make a good leader. "Understanding comes through experience," Thak replied without condemnation. "You could not have known what you had not yet learned, but now you have witnessed something that will serve you well in future challenges. The difference between seeming and being, between surface appearances and underlying reality." Jek, the youngest of the hunters, looked around the warm cave with wonder, still evident in his expression. "The fire truly is magnificent," he said admiringly. "The heat reaches every corner of our shelter. How did you learn to build such a thing?" Thak's weathered face creased into a smile as he settled himself more comfortably beside the fire pit. "Many winters of making mistakes and learning from them. Many nights of watching fires fail and trying to understand why. Many hours of listening to elders who were wiser than I was, even when their methods seemed slow or outdated." He gestured to the carefully arranged coals that formed the foundation of their magnificent blaze. "This technique was taught to me by my predecessor, old Grok, who learned it from his predecessor before him. Each generation has added refinements, improvements born of necessity and experience. What you see here is not just my knowledge, but the accumulated wisdom of many fire keepers who faced similar challenges. Mira shifted little Locke in her arms, the infant now sleeping peacefully in the wonderful warmth. So the old ways are not truly old, she said thoughtfully. They are constantly growing, constantly adapting. The principles are ancient, Thak agreed. Patience, observation, respect for the elements we work with, these never change. But the applications can always be refined, always improved by those willing to learn from both success and failure. He looked directly at Korg again, his expression serious but kind. Your strength will be needed in the days ahead, young hunter, but I hope you will also consider learning some of the older skills, not to replace your natural gifts, but to enhance them. A hunter who understands patience as well as power, who can read the subtle signs as well as the obvious ones, becomes doubly valuable to his band. Korg nodded slowly, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine humility and interest. Will you teach me, Firekeeper? Will you share these techniques despite my earlier words and actions? The question hung in the air for a moment, weighted with the implications of forgiveness, second chances, and the possibility of transformation. Around the circle, band members waited to see how their elder would respond to this plea for redemption from the one who had challenged him so cruelly. Of course I will teach you, Thak replied to Korg's request with such immediate warmth that several band members smiled despite the seriousness of the moment. Knowledge shared becomes stronger, not weaker. A firekeeper who hoards his wisdom is like a hunter who refuses to teach others to track. Eventually the band suffers for such selfishness. Korg's relief was visible in the relaxation of his massive shoulders and the brightening of his expression. Thank you, Firekeeper. I will be a better student than I was a challenger. You will be an excellent student, Thak assured him, because you have learned the most important lesson already, that true strength comes from recognizing what you do not know and seeking to understand it. As if responding to the renewed harmony within the cave, the sound of wind outside began to change. Where it had been a constant howling roar for days, it now seemed to fluctuate, rising and falling in patterns that suggested the great storm might finally be losing some of its power. Asha tilted her head, listening carefully to the altered sounds. Grandfather, do you hear that? The wind? It sounds different. Thak nodded slowly, his weathered ear trained on the subtle changes in the storm's voice. After so many winters of survival, he had learned to read the language of weather like other men read tracks in the snow. The fury is beginning to pass, he said with quiet confidence. The storm still rages, but its heart is moving away from our valley. Hope flickered in the faces around the fire as band members began to imagine an end to their imprisonment in the cave. Days of enforced inactivity, constant hunger and growing desperation had taken their toll on everyone's spirits. But the magnificent fire and the resolution of their internal conflict had already begun the healing process. How long? Jack asked eagerly. How long before we can hunt again? Patience, young hunter, Thak replied with gentle amusement. The storm may weaken, but the snow it has dropped will remain. The cold will linger, and our prey animals will be as hungry and desperate as we are, which makes them both easier to find and more dangerous to approach. Korg leaned forward intently, his earlier hostility now replaced by genuine interest in learning. What do we do first when the storm passes? How do we begin to restore our situation? Thak gestured toward the cave entrance where snow had piled so high that only a narrow opening remained. First, we must dig our way out safely, without bringing an avalanche down on ourselves. Then we must assess the landscape, where the drifts are deepest, where the ice might be too treacherous to cross, where the animals might have sought shelter. He pointed to their dwindling food stores with a practical expression. Our immediate need is meat, but we must be careful not to exhaust our remaining strength in failed hunting attempts. A hungry hunter who grows weak from fruitless searches helps no one. The fire will help, Asha observed thoughtfully. With it burning so efficiently, we can maintain warmth while using less fuel. That gives us more energy for hunting and gathering. Excellent reasoning, child, Thak praised, and the young woman beamed with pride. This is exactly the kind of thinking that turns survival into success, understanding how each element supports the others. Mira looked down at her sleeping infant with a mixture of hope and concern. Little Locke has grown so thin. Will he have the strength to survive the hunting time? He will, Yura assured her firmly. Children are more resilient than we often think, and now that we have proper warmth, his body can use its energy for growth instead of simply fighting the cold. As if summoned by their discussion, the wind outside gave a particularly strong gust, followed by what sounded almost like a sigh as the pressure seemed to release slightly. The constant battering sound that had become so familiar began to fade into something more intermittent. "It's definitely weakening," Brack said with growing excitement. "I can feel it in the way the air moves through the cave entrance." Thak stood and walked carefully toward the narrow opening that remained unblocked by snow. The others watched as he stood very still, listening not just with his ears, but with his entire body, reading the subtle signs that spoke of changing weather patterns. "The storm's center has moved beyond our valley," he announced after several minutes of careful observation. "We may see the sun again within a day or two." A collective cheer went up from the band members, and several of the children clapped their hands with delight. The prospect of sunlight, of leaving their cave sanctuary, of resuming the active life of hunters and gatherers, filled everyone with renewed energy. "But we must prepare carefully," Thak cautioned, raising his hand to temper their enthusiasm. "The world outside will be transformed by this storm. Familiar paths may be buried under impassable snow. Safe crossing places may now be treacherous. We cannot simply rush out and expect everything to be as it was before." Korg nodded thoughtfully, his hunter's instincts already engaged with the challenges ahead. "What would you have us do, Firekeeper? How do we prepare for conditions we have never faced before?" The question showed how completely the dynamic between the two men had changed. Where once Korg had dismissed Thak's methods as outdated and useless, he now sought the elder's guidance with genuine respect and eagerness to learn. "We start with what we know," Thak replied, settling back down beside the magnificent fire that continued to burn with steady efficiency. "The storm came from the north and moved toward the south. This means the deepest snow will be on the south-facing slopes where the wind drove it. The northern slopes may actually be clearer than usual, swept clean by the same winds that buried other areas." He used a stick to draw patterns in the dirt beside the fire pit, creating a rough map of their valley and the surrounding terrain. "Here, where the river bends, there will likely be ice dams from the snow melt when the sun returns. But here, in the protected hollow where the elk sometimes shelter, we may find both animals and accessible hunting grounds." Young Asher watched intently as Thak sketched the landscape from memory, his detailed knowledge of their territory evident in every line he drew. "You know every part of our land," she said admiringly. "After 15 winters of leading hunts and gathering expeditions, a man learns the shape of his world," Thak replied modestly. "But knowledge is only valuable when it's shared and used wisely." As the evening progressed, and the magnificent fire continued to provide warmth and light, the band settled into planning sessions that felt more hopeful than any discussion they had held in days. The resolution of their internal conflict, combined with the promise of the storm's end, had transformed their mood from despair to cautious optimism. Outside, the wind continued to weaken, and occasionally brief moments of relative quiet suggested that their long imprisonment in the cave was finally nearing its end. The first rays of sunlight in 6 days filtered through the narrow opening at the cave entrance, casting golden beams that seemed almost magical after so much darkness and storm. The light struck the still-burning fire and created dancing patterns on the cave walls, while band members stirred from their sleep with expressions of wonder and relief. Thak had maintained the magnificent fire throughout the night, feeding it with the same precise technique that had created such amazement the day before. But now he was not alone in his vigil. Korg sat beside him, watching intently as the old firekeeper demonstrated the subtle art of nighttime fire maintenance. "See how the coals glow differently in the hours before dawn?" Thak asked quietly, not wanting to wake the others who still slept. "The air is coldest then, and the fire must work harder to maintain its heat. But if you understand this rhythm, you can prepare for it." Korg nodded, his earlier arrogance replaced by the genuine attention of a dedicated student. "The wood you added during the middle of the night, it was different from what you used earlier. Denser wood burns slower and produces more heat," Thak explained. "Perfect for the coldest hours when efficiency matters most, but it would have been wasted during the day when we needed quick flames for light and cooking." The young hunter absorbed this knowledge with the same intensity he had once brought to tracking prey or preparing weapons. "Every choice has a reason," he said thoughtfully. "Every action serves a greater purpose." "Now you begin to understand what wisdom truly means," Thak replied with satisfaction. "Not just knowing many things, but understanding how all knowledge fits together to serve life itself." As more band members awakened and gathered around the warm fire pit, they could hear that the wind outside had diminished to occasional gusts, rather than the constant roar that had dominated their world for nearly a week. The change was so dramatic that several people commented on the relative silence. "It's so quiet," Xena whispered, bouncing little Nara gently in her arms. I had almost forgotten what silence sounded like. Young Asher approached the cave entrance cautiously, staying well back from the snow-blocked opening, but trying to get a better view of the outside world. "I can see blue sky," she announced with excitement. "Just a small patch, but it's definitely blue sky." A murmur of anticipation went through the band as everyone absorbed the reality that their long imprisonment was finally ending. But their enthusiasm was tempered by the knowledge that enormous challenges still lay ahead of them. "The sun will help," Yura observed, warming her aged hands over the fire. "But we must be careful not to let hope make us reckless. The world outside will be harsh and dangerous in ways we have never experienced." Brack stood and stretched, his lean frame showing the effects of days of enforced inactivity and reduced food rations. "How do we begin? What's the first step in digging our way out?" Thak looked toward the blocked entrance thoughtfully. "Slowly and carefully. Too much enthusiasm could bring down more snow than we can handle. We must create a passage, not an avalanche." He gestured for Korg to join him as he moved toward the cave entrance. "This will be your first lesson in patience, young hunter. The same principles that govern fire building apply to snow removal, understanding the forces at work, respecting their power, and working with them rather than against them." Korg followed eagerly, his massive frame well suited for the heavy work ahead, but now guided by Thak's wisdom rather than his own impulsive strength. "What do we look for? How do we know if the snow is stable or dangerous?" "Listen," Thak said simply, placing his weathered hand against the cave wall near the entrance. "The snow speaks to those who know its language. Stable snow settles quietly. Dangerous snow shifts and whispers as pressure builds within it." They stood in silence for several moments, both men pressing their ears to the wall and listening to the subtle sounds from beyond their shelter. The rest of the band watched with interest as their firekeeper taught their strongest hunter the art of reading nature's hidden messages. "I hear settling sounds," Korg said uncertainly, "like small movements deep within the snow." "Good," Thak approved. "That means the snow is finding its natural resting place. If you heard sharp cracking sounds or sudden shifts, we would need to wait longer. But settling sounds mean we can begin working, carefully." Jek joined them at the entrance, his young energy barely contained. "May I help? I'm smaller than Korg. Perhaps I could work in tighter spaces." "Youth and enthusiasm are valuable," Thak replied with a slight smile. "But this task requires more than energy. It requires understanding the balance between progress and safety. Watch first, learn the principles, then contribute your strength to the effort." As they began the careful process of enlarging the opening, other band members prepared for the challenges that awaited outside. Mira nursed her infant son, trying to build his strength for the difficult times ahead. Ura sorted through their remaining food supplies, calculating how to stretch their meager resources until hunting could resume. Asha tended the magnificent fire, applying the lessons she had learned about maintaining efficient combustion. "Thak," Mira called softly from her place by the fire. "When we do emerge from the cave, how long do you think it will be before we can hunt successfully, before we can find enough food to restore our strength?" The old firekeeper paused in his work and considered the question carefully. "That depends on many factors we cannot yet assess," he replied honestly. "The depth of the snow, the condition of the game animals, the accessibility of our usual hunting grounds. But I believe we will find opportunities if we approach them with wisdom rather than desperation." He looked around at the faces of his band members, seeing hope mixed with understandable anxiety. "Remember what we have learned during these difficult days. Patience achieves what haste cannot. Understanding succeeds where force fails. Unity creates strength that no individual could possess alone." Korg nodded emphatically from his position near the entrance. "The fire taught us that lesson clearly. What appeared to be failure was actually preparation for success." "Exactly," Thak agreed, "and the same principle will guide us in the days ahead. What appears to be an impossible challenge may actually be an opportunity for those wise enough to see it clearly." As they worked steadily to enlarge their escape route, the sounds from outside continued to change. The wind diminished further, and occasionally they could hear new sounds. The creaking of ice, the distant call of a bird, the subtle settling of snow as the sun's warmth began its work. "The world is waking up," Asher observed wonderingly. After all the silence and stillness, the world is coming back to life. As are we, Thak replied with quiet satisfaction. As are we. 3 days later, the hunter-gatherer band stood at the entrance of their cave, breathing deeply of the crisp, clean air that carried the promise of renewal. The world before them had indeed been transformed by the great storm, familiar landmarks buried under pristine white expanses, trees bent and broken by the wind's fury, and the landscape sculpted into entirely new patterns by the relentless forces of nature. But they were no longer the same band that had huddled in desperate fear just a week before. Something fundamental had changed during their time of trial, something that went far deeper than their improved circumstances or the magnificent fire that still burned steadily behind them. Korg stood beside Thak at the cave mouth, the two men now working in harmony as they assessed the challenges and opportunities that lay before them. The young hunter's massive frame was still impressive, his strength still formidable, but it was now tempered by a humility and wisdom that made him far more valuable to the band than he had ever been before. There, Thak pointed toward a distant ridge, where dark shapes moved against the white snow. Elk, driven down from the high country by the storm. They'll be hungry and searching for whatever vegetation they can find beneath the snow. The hunting will be dangerous, Korg observed thoughtfully. The snow is deep and we're all weakened by the days of short rations, but if we approach them carefully, with patience and planning, rather than desperate haste, you have learned well, my friend, Thak replied with genuine warmth. The word friend carried special weight, a recognition of how completely their relationship had been transformed by recent events. Behind them, the rest of the band prepared for their emergence into the changed world. Children laughed with excitement at the prospect of leaving the cave, while adults made final checks of weapons, tools, and the precious bundles of supplies they would need for survival in the harsh conditions outside. Young Asher approached the two men with a bundle of carefully prepared torches in her arms. Grandfather, the fire torches are ready. Each one should burn for at least half a day, long enough for hunting parties to maintain warmth during extended searches. Excellent work, child, Thak praised, examining the torches with an expert eye. Each one had been prepared using the same principles of efficient combustion that had created their magnificent cave fire, carefully selected materials arranged to burn cleanly and provide maximum heat and light. Jek joined them, his young face bright with eagerness for the hunt ahead. Firekeeper, will you share the technique for these torches? I want to learn everything I can about working with fire. Of course, Thak replied, then looked around at the gathered band members. In fact, I believe it's time for all of us to learn these skills. We have seen how valuable this knowledge can be during times of crisis. He moved to stand where everyone could see and hear him clearly, his weathered face serious but optimistic. The storm has taught us many lessons. About the value of patience over haste, about the power of wisdom combined with strength, about the importance of unity when facing challenges that threaten our survival. Korg stepped forward to stand beside him, his expression showing none of the arrogance or hostility that had marked their earlier interactions. It has also taught us about the danger of pride, he added honestly, about the foolishness of dismissing knowledge we don't understand, about the strength that comes from admitting our mistakes and learning from them. The band members nodded thoughtfully, understanding that they were witnessing something significant, not just the end of a crisis, but the birth of a stronger, wiser community. From now on, Thak continued, we will all learn from each other. The hunters will teach their skills to those who tend the fires and gather food. The firekeepers will share their knowledge with those who track game and craft tools. The wisdom of the elders will guide the strength of the young, while the energy of youth will carry forward the traditions that have kept us alive. Ura stepped forward, her aged frame moving with renewed dignity. The children especially must learn these lessons, she said firmly. They must understand that survival comes not from any single talent, but from the combination of all our knowledge and abilities. Little Nara, now much recovered thanks to the warmth and improved spirits of the band, clapped her small hands together. Mama, will I learn to make the big fire too? Yes, little star, Xena replied with a smile, holding her daughter close. You will learn everything you need to know to help keep our band strong and safe. Mira bounced her infant son gently, looking out at the snow-covered world with hope rather than fear. Locke will grow up knowing these truths from the beginning, she said softly. He will never have to learn them through conflict and pain as we did. Perhaps not, Thak replied thoughtfully, but every generation faces its own challenges, its own tests of character and wisdom. What we can give him is the foundation of knowledge and the understanding that strength and wisdom must work together. As they prepared to leave their cave sanctuary and face the challenges of hunting and gathering in the storm-transformed landscape, the sacred fire continued to burn behind them, not as a symbol of any single person's mastery, but as a representation of what could be accomplished when knowledge was shared, when pride gave way to cooperation, and when the wisdom of experience guided the energy of youth. Korg looked back at the magnificent blaze one final time before they departed. "Firekeeper," he said quietly, "I want to thank you for the greatest lesson of all." "Which lesson was that?" Thak asked with genuine curiosity. "That true strength is not the power to tear down, but the wisdom to build up," Korg replied. "That a real leader doesn't need to defeat others to prove their worth. They prove it by helping others become stronger." Thak nodded with deep satisfaction, understanding that the young hunter had learned far more than just fire-building techniques during their time of crisis. He had learned what it truly meant to be part of a community, to be responsible for more than just his own survival. As the band set out into the brilliant white world beyond their cave, they carried with them not just the tools and knowledge they would need to survive the harsh conditions ahead, but something far more valuable: renewed understanding of what made them strong as a people and what would keep them strong for generations to come. The sacred fire burned on behind them, tended now by the shared wisdom of the entire band, its light and warmth a symbol of the unbreakable bonds that had been forged in the crucible of crisis and emerged stronger than ever before. In the distance, the elk moved against the pristine snow, and the hunt began anew, not with the desperate haste of starvation, but with the patient confidence of those who had learned that the greatest victories often come disguised as defeats, and that wisdom, when properly applied, could indeed light fires that would burn brighter than anyone had dared to imagine.